Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening if you're joining us from the other side of the Pacific. My name is Gregory Poling. I direct the Southeast Asia Program and the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative here at CSIS. And I am going to be joined by my longtime friend, I think first-time guest, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, a fellow with the Wilson Center. Before we get into the discussion with Prashanth, just a bit of housekeeping. If you are watching this, I assume you're doing it over csis.org or YouTube. Everything is going to be on the record. The video will be saved so you can watch it later. And we will have an audience Q&A session in the back half of the event, which if you want to ask a question to Prashanth, you can go ahead and type it in, and we'll be able to see it on our end, and I'll read it out to Prashanth. And with that, let me go ahead and introduce the real star of the show, Prashanth's new book. So we are here to talk about Elusive Balances, Shaping U.S. Southeast Asia Strategy. And let me flip over to Prashanth and ask the most important question. What made you want to write a book?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Greg, and to the team at CSIS, both for hosting this and then also all the great work you guys continue to do on Southeast Asia. On the issue of why I wrote the book, I guess there's been, any number of books written on Southeast Asia's relations with China, even, individual topics within Southeast Asia and U.S. policy. I mean, your own book coming out on the South China Sea, for example. So, there's all that, and there's also a lot of great short form pieces on U.S. policy in Southeast Asia broadly. What I wanted to do in this book, though, is to look more closely at the specific issue of U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia, because I think it's something that with each administration, we almost have the sort of same debate when administration comes in. How much does it care about Asia? How much does it care about Southeast Asia? Within Southeast Asia, what are the priorities? Is it really about Southeast Asia, or is it about China? Is it about terrorism? And I wanted to figure out what is a good framework to have that broader conversation. And that's essentially what the book tries to do. And the essential framework and the argument that the book sort of makes on the issue of commitment is that it's less about what a single administration does, or in fact, what's going on in U.S. policy in Southeast Asia itself. It really is a dynamic between the domestic management of U.S. policy that has to do with how U.S. policymakers make trade-offs between Southeast Asia, but also events in the United States and around the world. And then within the region, really a conversation about how do we think about U.S. commitment, not just the level of commitment, but what kind of commitment? How much is the U.S. committed to multilateral institutions, to economics, to security, to human rights? And so that sort of two-way debate between what happens here domestically and then what happens in the region is kind of the way that the book looks at that commitment issue.
So can you walk us through a little bit what the model you've developed, what you call the balance of commitment model?
Right. So the balance of commitment model essentially comes from the topic of, first, how do we understand commitment, and then what is causing changes in commitment? So the sort of top line you'll hear whenever you talk to Southeast Asians about U.S. policy is, well, we see kind of ebbs, flows, and imbalances. Sometimes the U.S. comes in, sometimes you're not present in the region, sometimes you're more about talking more about security, less on economics, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, how do we develop a model that encompasses both the imbalances in U.S. policy domestically and then also the imbalances that are seen in the region? And the way the book looks at it is there's a series of balances that U.S. policymakers have to confront. And I want to acknowledge, right off the bat, when I was doing interviews for this book, essentially, I got variations of the same response, which is, from people who've been doing this work, over the course of several decades, which is, this is really hard work to do. Balance of commitment comes from the frame that it's a series of balancing acts that U.S. policymakers have to walk through. Domestically, the balancing act is between U.S. capabilities and U.S. power, which waxes and wanes in and of itself relative to other powers, whether it's the Soviet Union, and we the book goes back all the way back to the end of the Vietnam War out to the present, and now U.S.-China competition. But also not just power, but how do U.S. policymakers perceive and rank and prioritize their threats, right? Is it really China that's getting the most attention, or is it counterterrorism, or is it in the contemporary case, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the elevation there? And then so power, threats, and then also resources. So importantly, U.S. policymakers can perceive certain threats, they can have capabilities, but how do they actually have the resources and mobilize those resources to actually achieve those ends? So that's the domestic part of the balance of commitment framework. The regional part is a little bit more complicated, but I think I would summarize it as a series of imbalances that are perceived sometimes in the region with the U.S. policy, which we keep hearing. I mean, I was really surprised when I went through the book. At the end of the Vietnam War out to the present, it's really the same 5 or 6 imbalances that we're talking about. So imbalances between bilateralism and multilateralism, imbalances between economics and security, ideals and interests, cooperation and sort of conflictual or sometimes competitive approaches to adversaries, whether it's the Soviet Union or China or even Japan, right, in the 1980s. So those are the sort of 5 or 6 areas that I would say are the imbalances in Southeast Asia. And the key is, how do U.S. policymakers in the balance of commitment framework both do the balancing acts at home and also accommodate the balances and imbalances that are perceived in the region? And unsurprisingly, each administration finds it very difficult to do both all across the board comprehensively.
So you term this balance of commitment, I think very purposely to point out that the neorealists and balance of power kind of get it wrong, or at least don't tell the whole story. I think the post end of the Cold War period case study in your book is very enlightening. Like, if the U.S. was riding so high, why is it that we didn't see more engagement, as would have been predicted by the realists? You also give it to the constructivists a little bit. I think you let the liberal institutionalists off a bit in the book. But in general, what are the traditional IR fields, the traditional IR theories getting wrong in the region that you felt had to be corrected?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I'm glad you picked up on that point, because that's something which I've gotten a little bit of pushback on in terms of, how far are you really pushing the sort of theoretical tradition? Because in the book, I sort of mentioned that the various theories and current approaches to international relations don't really do the complexity of U.S. commitment to Southeast Asia enough justice. So with the neorealists, there is an emphasis, rightly so, I think, on power and threats, and particularly at the regional and international level. But there isn't really that focus as much on the domestic level dynamics, particularly the mobilization of capabilities and resources, which I think is really important in a Southeast Asian context. And, I think you mentioned the post-Cold War period, which is a really interesting example where you had leaders from Southeast Asia coming to the United States and being very concerned, actually, speaking in think tanks, mentioning, we're really concerned that without this unifying threat of the Soviet Union, the United States is going to face a real big difficulty in the post-Cold War conflict context, bringing together all these priorities. It's not possible to advance economic interests, security interests, democracy, human rights, and sort of be attentive to major power dynamics all at the same time, right? So that was one area. And with the constructivist perspective, I did feel like the idea of the fact that non-material sources of power, right? So ideas of how Southeast Asia is constructed in and of itself, like what is ASEAN in the sort of scheme of U.S. policy, which is itself something that we're still working out. I do think there's merit to that. But I also think a lot of the debates we're having, particularly if you look at the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, the last real 20 years has really evolved into a very specific question about U.S. resources matching what U.S. words are actually saying. And I think that makes the debate skew a little bit more in the direction of, the framework I use for the book, which is kind of neoclassical realism, which, I think, there's a critique there about it's a little bit of a cop-out because you're saying it's regional, international, and domestic. But I do think it's a good way for this particular topic to bring together a lot of those dynamics in a related way, particularly on the resourcing component, and then also like more specific questions about. We talk a lot about threats, but the big question I hear consistently in Southeast Asia is what is the specific threat hierarchy, the ranking of U.S. threats, and how does that change over time? And then on resourcing, really what is the ability of the U.S. government, and if you want to look bureaucratically, the National Security Council, to bring together all these various agencies in the U.S. government together and marshal those resources at a time when the debate, every time I go back to Southeast Asia, I hear the same refrain, which is that we've got this conversation about the United States and U.S. policy more cohesively, but the debate in the region is almost, the United States and other powers need a strategy. If you're talking about Malaysia, not just for Kuala Lumpur, they need a strategy for Sabah. They need a strategy for Sarawak, right? Ambassador Mark Napper was just out at the Mekong Delta, and he said something which probably rings through of all of Southeast Asia, which is the U.S. needs the strategy for each and every province in Vietnam. Right. And that's something which all powers are thinking about, not just the United States, China, Japan, so on and so forth. And so that dynamic between the domestic and the regional is also something that's really important.
So let's bring this out of the academy a little bit into the real world. You've got 4 case studies that you use to stress test your model. Post Vietnam, you talked about post Cold War, post 9/11, global war on terror, and then post global financial crisis. Which of these 4 do you think was most interesting, where you found the biggest maybe divergence between the model that you're trying to develop and what you think the classical realist model would have predicted?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say, to be honest, all of these cases really were tough tests for the model, only because when you're testing things from the perspective of power and threats versus, the more sort of domestic level explanations, a lot of particularly in the earlier periods in the post-Vietnam War period and the post-Cold War period, it tended to be dominated by perspectives about power and threats. But as I said, in the more contemporary setting, in the last 20 years, I think we are beginning to have more of a 2-level debate about the conversation about U.S. domestic politics here, and then the sort of changing regional dynamics as well. So I would say all of them, but in particular, if you were to ask me to pick, I would say the case that's probably the most difficult would have been the post-Vietnam War period, because I think that's where the explanation has tended to be towards, we withdrew from the Vietnam War. Clearly, this was a sense of the United States at its sort of height of commitment, and it was withdrawing. And that really explains most of what happened in the post-Vietnam War period. And actually, if you look at the actual history, and the good thing about that period is that we have all the declassified documents. So we know actually what these officials were saying in the room. We know Richard Nixon was saying, our big challenge is we know our commitments are not going to be able to be kept, but we need to let the Southeast Asians know that they're going to be kept, and we need to let the Soviets and the Chinese know that they're going to be kept as well. So we know that. What we know less about, and I think has been less emphasized, is that in the Carter administration in particular, there was already an effort underway, in spite of the fact that the United States was withdrawing in the security domain, to actually reinforce diplomatic and economic commitment to Southeast Asia, which then developed out in the 1980s. And I think one of the contributions that I hope to make with the balance of commitment framework is that we really need to broaden the way we're thinking about U.S. commitment in the traditional sense, which usually tends to be more security focused. And here there is a deliberate effort to look at diplomatic commitment, to look at economic commitment, and even people-to-people relations. In fact, one of my advisors, when I wrote my initial dissertation, in which the book was based, Professor Robert Sutter, actually urged me to go even further in the book and said, you're actually spending too little time on people-to-people ties. That's actually a place where U.S. strategy is actually expanding even more. And I would say that's a fair critique of the book. It gets through some of these top line ways of measuring commitment, but I definitely think over the next 20 or 30 years, I definitely expect U.S. commitment to be measured in a more granular way. I think even in the Obama administration, when there were public assessments by the Senate and other organizations, think tanks like CSIS, there was actually a very deliberate effort to measure what are the metrics to use to actually measure a pivot or a rebalance or whatever we want to call a strategy to the region.
So I'm glad you led us to that discussion, because commitment is probably one of the most overused words in DC. And pretty early on in the book, you make clear that saying ASEAN centrality in joint statements isn't commitment, right? I mean, just talking about ASEAN, having good feelings about regional architecture isn't commitment to the region. What exactly do you mean when you say commitment? The U.S. commitment decreased markedly post-Vietnam and moderately or slightly after the end of the Cold War, and then increased post 9/11.
Yeah, I mean that's I think a fair point in terms of commitment. I think it's still overused and abused really quite frequently. One of the recommendations I actually have in the book is that there is a case beyond this, like, my own academic interest in this and, the sort of scholarly conversation and what we can do in think tanks. I really do think having a more granular conversation about what do we mean by commitment, what are the metrics, and almost, a dashboard for each administration to kind of measure the differences between words and actions is well needed. And I think you could make that for security, you can make that for diplomacy, you can make that for economics. But I also admit, that you can go down a rabbit hole. So one of the pushbacks I got in one of the conversations I did regionally recently was, so let's say we're talking about U.S. high-level visits to the region relative to if we're applying this model to, say, China or Japan. Should we discount one U.S. visit to the region or one Chinese visit to the region because China is more geographically proximate to some of these Southeast Asian countries? So presumably, one school of thought would suggest U.S. diplomats should actually get more credit for making the trip all the way from the United States to Southeast Asia. And I think maybe all of us who make those trips would try to want to say you should get credit for that. But it's a very tough conversation, I'll admit, to have on commitment. What the book starts by saying in terms of commitment, it defines it in a very sort of Tom Schelling-esque way, which is, it's a very strict definition that says commitment requires you to make trade-offs. You have to actually have a series of actions which you're constrained to do and the deployment of actual resources rather than something that's a rhetorical commitment. So just to give a tangible example, if you have an administration coming out saying, we prioritize Southeast Asia and we want to emphasize high-level visits and we're going to have a summit, right? That's not a commitment. What is a commitment is, a couple of examples, US, so let's say, President Biden would say, I'm going to make a visit to Vietnam and Indonesia, and he's going to be doing that and producing deliverables. That's a commitment. The actual operationalization of funding for specific projects is commitment, not the announcement of a $500 million package that is going to be then operationalized into projects. So it's a very strict definition. But I realize that, within the context that we are in now, in particular, where we're seeing a big lag between rhetorical commitments and actual action, that is a pretty strict definition. But the reason why I chose that in the book is I just don't see any other way that we're going to help bridge the divide between, what is said in Washington and then the inevitable perception in the region, which is, okay, we're waiting to see how this is going to translate into resources. And the one thing I keep saying is that, the United States is not competing with the worst version of itself. It's competing with the reality that the dynamic in the last 10 or 20 years in Southeast Asia is not just that the U.S. has pivoted to Southeast Asia, is that everyone has pivoted to Southeast Asia because of the region's growing importance. That's good for the U.S. to do work with allies and partners, but it also raises the bar for what specifically is the United States providing. So not infrastructure, but what kinds of infrastructure, what kinds of areas, and what kinds of funding streams that are being used that are new. So that, I think, is a bit of a different debate than we were having, say, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago.
Right. I like this framework. So, writing ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific strategy is not commitment. Giving 1% of foreign military financing to Asia Pacific shows 1% commitment on that metric. And there's no getting around that there are real costs And benefits here that have to be weighed. The president's time is a commitment, and when you're not spending it in Asia, that sends a message. So let's look at 2022. You lay out this framework. You've got your three variables: relative power, threat perception, and then the mobilization of resources within government. So how are we doing under the Biden administration on those three? What would your model predict?
Yeah, so I would say I like to try to be optimistic. So I'll give the positive side first, and then I'll go into the challenges that I think we all probably know what those are. So I think the big thing that's been changing is that on power and capabilities, I think the United States is still positioned as really the first among equals still, right, in terms of the sort of global balance of power. And in the region, that's certainly still the case, even though the big question really is what is the messaging and what is the actual reality of power dynamics, right? And we've seen if you look back, you step back a little bit and look at the past three administrations, they've all had different messaging in terms of whether to think about a more multipolar world, a more bipolar world, or a more unipolar world. So that's a separate messaging point. But I think we can agree that on the issue of U.S. capabilities, that's still there, even though there are doubts in the region about how that's going to be mobilized. I think the big change we're seeing on the threat perception front is that I think we can safely say there's been a heightened threat perception with respect to China in particular and what it's doing in the region. And that if folks had hoped that that would change under the Biden administration, I think it's pretty clear that that is there to stay, at least in the short term, absent some sort of crisis that would take U.S. interests and attention elsewhere. I think what the model predicts on the resourcing side is that that's where you probably have the most difficulty. There's a whole string of domestic challenges that the Biden administration has, and then also the mobilization dynamics are also more complicated, given the sort of narrow majority, given the fact that you have a midterm election coming up. So that's kind of the domestic piece of the conversation. I think the region is still waiting to sort of hear on how the U.S.-China debate settles, and also the resourcing point. I think what that says about imbalances, though, is that you're likely to see imbalances in a certain number of areas more so than others. In particular, you're going to see imbalances in the balance between security and economics because it's traditionally harder. So security is stickier, and it's one where the U.S. has been more capable, primarily because the Pentagon is a lot more well-resourced, and also there's more sort of kinetic ongoing exercises on a calendar level basis. But economic commitment, which has been the U.S. sort of Achilles heel, particularly because the United States is not intrinsically part of the economic architecture, it has to actually work its way into it. That's where you're going to see a big challenge. And I think you are seeing that. There's two other areas I would say. One is the debate between ideals and interests. I think this is still playing out. But when you have a period of heightened threat perceptions with respect to an adversary, as you did during the Cold War, you do see periods of time where administrations will use that as a clarifying moment for democracy versus autocracy. And I can understand why this is being done. And it might make sense for a domestic audience. The problem is regionally in Southeast Asia, it doesn't look very good in terms of the democratic outlook across the region. So when you're trying to make that kind of model work, I think we're seeing a few challenges. There's ways to get around that, to talk less about just the aggregate conversation, to talk more about the sort of granular areas. And that's something I think the Biden administration is trying to do, but it's extremely difficult. And the final one I kind of mentioned and touched on earlier, the dynamic between how competitive you are with your adversaries and your competitors versus how collaborative you are. And I think we haven't seen from the region, and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong from Singapore was just here recently in Washington and basically asked a version of this question, which is being asked in Southeast Asia, which is, we understand the United States is competing with China. Our big question is, where are we going to see the balance between collaboration and competition? And then if there is a competition, what is the United States bringing to the table? And do you see this competition being symmetric, asymmetric? If we're looking at supply chains, do you see this being a bifurcation, or do you see it in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as being something where we can talk about specific areas, sectoral areas rather than an aggregate debate. All those things, I don't think we've had a conclusion yet about where we're landing. And of course, I mean, there are others. I mean, the balance between multilateralism and bilateral institutions. But actually, in the Biden administration's defense, I think they've done a good job of, basically saying, we agree that ASEAN is relevant. We're going to hold a summit, work with ASEAN, but we're also going to invest in bilateral relationships. We're also going to invest in unilateral mechanisms like the Quad and AUKUS, and we're going to do all of the above rather than ask the question, oh, ASEAN is not doing X or Y, so we rhetorically have to adjust it, which, by the way, China is very comfortable working with ASEAN while also undermining ASEAN or behind ASEAN's back talking about its limitations, right? I almost think that's a kind of a false binary that we create if we think our rhetoric has to align with the reality.
I want to pick that one apart a little bit more, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So under the Obama administration, I think it was safe to say that we saw a higher degree of imbalance toward multilateralism and away from bilateralism, a real investment in ASEAN as an institution. And then the Trump administration swung back the other way, right? ASEAN doesn't really matter. Let's focus on bilateral relationships. The Biden administration, as you say, does seem to have found more of a balance here. They have one foot in ASEAN and one foot focused on the bilateral relationship. So I think they're perhaps more cynical than many of them were because they served in the Obama administration. But their multilateralism is not the traditional ASEAN-focused multilateralism, right? I mean, we're focused on the Quad, and we're focused on this vague network of trilaterals and bilaterals and quadrilaterals. And so what does that mean for the U.S.-ASEAN relationship going forward? Are we seeing a new paradigm where multilateralism need not actually be grounded just in ASEAN?
Yeah, I agree with you, Greg. That's like a really interesting trend that we're seeing because the way I see it actually, there's a bit of alignment actually between what's happening in U.S. policy and what's happening in the region. I mean, the big thing, and you and I have talked about this before, I think the big change in Southeast Asia is that even within Southeast Asia, there's more of an awareness about the limitations and constraints of ASEAN and what ASEAN can do. And we are seeing more minilateral approaches. I wouldn't say, sort of an embrace of the Quad, but I would say the Quad itself is changing to a more sort of, we'll talk about China, we'll talk about other issues, but we'll also provide public goods. And that almost creates a new dynamic where, and one of the pushback points I've gotten among many in the book is, yes, it's great to have this balance between bilateralism and multilateralism. But in fact, all of these areas, I would concede the point, and I make this point in the conclusion as well, we are having a more granular debate about a spectrum of approaches. So bilateral approaches, multilateral approaches, minilateral ones like the Quad and AUKUS, and also, yes, trilaterals, a few sort of informal networks within Southeast Asia. And I would just say the more granular and focused that U.S. policymakers are on that, the better. So the Mekong is a great example, right? It's a sub-regional mechanism, but there are other sub-regional mechanisms in the region too, which I know we kind of laugh them off, BIMPEAGA, for example, and all of the above. But I can say that there other powers are engaging those mechanisms, and they're aware of those limitations, but it doesn't prevent them from having a sort of all-around approach to how we deal with that. So I almost think we need to be a bit more flexible on the paths we're taking to engage and focus more on the substance. Like what is the need, what are the demands, and some of these things ASEAN can do very well. Other things it can't. And actually, the big challenge is if you took the ASEAN founding fathers from their grave and put them into the contemporary realities, they'd be really shocked that we're having a debate annually about whether U.S. president's going to attend the U.S.-ASEAN summit. That wasn't what ASEAN was meant for, but it's expanded. It's expanded in scope, expanded in membership, but ASEAN hasn't made the structural mechanism changes that it needs to actually live up to that. And I think there's a recognition in the region that means that there needs to be adaptations in the region, but also other powers are going to adjust to that as well. And I think the United States, probably is in that camp.
Well, I think if you took most of the ASEAN founding fathers out of their graves and told them that there would be 10 members of ASEAN and that it would be trying to manage issues like the South China Sea and technology cooperation, they would say, where did we go wrong? But that's another discussion about ASEAN's own mission. Let me go to the audience. We've got a few questions already in the queue, and I'd encourage everybody to go ahead and get some more in. First, we have Chris Weston with BRMG. Chris says, does Dr. Parameswaran believe that the ongoing crisis in Ukraine may deflect U.S. attention and resources from this all-important region?
Yeah, I think that's the big question of the day. I kind of alluded to this at the outset in terms of, I didn't mean for the book to be timed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, definitely. But I think it does. It's the latest, right, in a slew of debates we've had about the United States saying that we have an Asia first foreign policy. That's where our investments lie. But any number of challenges coming to the fore, then risking misdirecting U.S. attention. And I think we can't sort of reset that debate or pretend that debate is resetted every time we have it, right? I think the experience of the Obama administration, the region was there, they understand it. And so when we have a latter debate, there's understandably more focus on the granularities. So it's well and good, and I understand, that the Biden administration needs to have the messaging right, which is, we are still focused on this. We're going to make high-level visits. We're going to invest in the U.S. ASEAN summit. But I think, Edgard Kagan put it really well from the NSC when he said recently, we understand that the region will judge us by what we do, not what we say. And I think it's very granular, that conversation. It's not just visits, but it's also, look at the U.S. defense budget. How many line items are there that prioritize Asia, let alone Southeast Asia? If you adjust the recent budget that came out for inflation, it's not great. If you project that onto the coming year, it might be even more challenging in that regard. So, and that's on the defense side, where, as I said, the Pentagon is pretty well resourced. And then if you look at economics and you look at the, any number of initiatives, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, measures that the Biden administration announced on new sectoral funding on health and climate, the funding streams are there. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that the region can count, right? They know where this assistance is coming from, how many of the programs are new, how many of them are rebranded. If it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the starting proposition is that that's a third choice alternative. The first is the U.S., rejoining CPTPP. The second is an actual digital agreement or some kind of agreement that actually is tangible. So standards is really important. And I actually think, to the credit of IPEF and the administration, these conversations about supply chains, granular sectoral conversations that we need to have on, pharmaceuticals and so on and so forth. These are really important. So I don't want to dismiss them. Infrastructure, anti-corruption, huge problems and challenges in the region. But standard setting only gets you so far in Southeast Asia, because you end up, and we've talked about this before, with the same usual suspects, right? And you talked a bit about this in the Trade Guys podcast recently. If we're talking about a framework that ends up with the same usual suspects in the room, then really what is U.S. policy doing, right? And if you want to take it even further, you could say the true test of comprehensiveness for U.S. policy is not how the United States is doing with respect to Indonesia, but how the United States is doing with respect to Laos, right? And that is problematic, not only because of the decisions that Laos is making in and of itself, but also the stretch bandwidths and how difficult it is to work with all of these 11 countries in Southeast Asia individually.
Yeah, I think you're making a key point on the resourcing here, where the administration, multiple administrations, will say, well, we've done more in Southeast Asia, and here's the laundry list. Here's the fact sheet that we present at every U.S. ASEAN summit to show how very, very serious we are. But these things aren't absolute, they're relative. And the region can count too. And they can say, well, how come Tunisia gets more security assistance than all of the Asia Pacific combined if we're really your top priority? And the administration has no good answers for that. Keeping with the economic point, though, we've got the next question from Mark Neely at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Mark said, do you think America's domestic politics have caught up with the new reality of ASEAN's rise in value to the U.S. and the global economy? In 2021, 6 of America's top 30 trading partners in the world were in ASEAN. Yet over a period of 18 months, the USG has mobilized billions in resources to help Ukraine, Europe's second poorest nation.
Yeah, I mean, Mark is probably a much better place to answer that question. But he's absolutely right in terms of, raising the question. I mean, that really is a good way to reframe it. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book intentionally from this prism of sort of a two-part, right, which is there's the US domestic debate about how we should prioritize Southeast Asia, but there's a whole other regional piece about how the region is evolving and how the region is perceiving what the US is doing. And I think Mark's absolutely right in terms of reframing it that way. So the question is not how much attention or commitment does the US have to Southeast Asia, but relative to where the region is today and the attention that other powers are giving the region, what is the United States doing in that regard, particularly economically? And I can safely say, it's not the case, right? We had a conversation 2 decades ago. The book kind of goes into how under the Bush administration there was a bilateral approach to trying to go towards FTAs. Had a success with Singapore, but that was really troubling with some other countries, including Malaysia, for example. And then we had this conversation in the Obama administration about plurilateral agreements or minilateral agreements or whatever we want to call it, and TPP. And then that didn't come to pass. And then now the Trump administration tried to go back to bilateral, and then now we're going back to regional. And all this time, it's not like Southeast Asia is standing still or its importance is decreasing. Actually, if you take the United States out of it, and I think sometimes it's really useful to just remove the United States out of the equation for a moment, you have the reality that Japan picked up the mantle on CPTPP and the region moved on it, and now digital agreements are being forged by Singapore, New Zealand, and other countries. And China has said it might not actually do so eventually, but it said that it will try to join both of those agreements, right? And China is making a big push on other economic initiatives with individual Southeast Asian countries. And I think one of the things that we sort of talked about U.S.-China competition, I think at least, I mean, I was struck by, writing the book, 20 or 10 years ago, U.S.-China competition is not new. I mean, the Bush administration came into office and everybody was saying we're aware of China, and then September 11 happened. So that's not new. But the way in which we're competing is really different. What China is doing, that's one part of it in terms of their economic initiatives. But also it's setting other players up to compete with China as well. So what Japan is doing in the region, really stepping up its game economically on the standards game, what Australia is doing, which is extremely significant, not necessarily in the same areas Japan is playing, but higher education, the investments they're making there, peacekeeping, and so on and so forth. So it's a different game, not just based on where the region is, but what China is doing, what other powers are doing. And then every time the United States leaves and re-enters the conversation, I almost feel like the region has changed. So it's not like we're resetting the debate. It's an entirely new platform that we're engaging on. And so the bar for entry, and Kurt Campbell's written very eloquently about this. Every time we sort of re-enter the conversation, the price of entry has gone up in the region, and the low-hanging fruit has been picked. And so each administration is graded tougher in the region in that regard and in that respect. And so I think, what can we do about it economically? I still think if IPEF is able to be implemented and furthered, if we can get past the conversation about pillars and individual countries, if a few Southeast Asian countries can be part of it, that's great. But that hopefully will be the start and not the end to U.S. economic policy. Need to find other ways to engage smaller countries like even Cambodia, even Laos, right? And there is an appetite, I think, in all of these countries. Some of them may be difficult, like Myanmar, but there is an appetite for the United States to engage in very specific areas and sectors where it brings advantages to the table. And I think that's where we have to have those conversations. And I would just say in closing, one of the things that I think is comforting about both the United States and Southeast Asia is that on both sides, I see more of a conversation about it's really difficult to cooperate perhaps in the aggregate, but let's talk about specific sectors. Let's talk about health. Let's talk about energy. And let's talk about supply chains, right, which we've talked about before. Let's talk about specific governance issues like the environment and forestry. I think the more granular you can get with that kind of cooperation, I think the more you'll find room for cooperation, and also emphasizing the value add that the United States has in this very crowded landscape.
I like your point, which I guess is Kurt's point, that U.S. commitment in each administration is not judged based on the clear absolute numbers. It's relative, based on what have you done since the last administration. It's not you don't get to rest on your laurels. And one of the things we hear about constantly when you're a South Asian is somebody trots out the numbers on U.S. FDI and says, well, actually, the U.S. has greater FDI stock in Southeast Asia than it does in China and India combined. And that's been true the entire time I've been in the field. But 20 years ago, that made the U.S. by far and away the number one economic partner of every country in the region. And today, the U.S. is not the top economic partner of any country in the region. So the fact that in absolute terms, your FDI stock hasn't shrunk doesn't change the fact that your relative level of power and therefore your relative commitment has been severely diminished as we've sat on our laurels.
Well, I think
yeah, please.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really important one, because FDI is a great indicator for economic commitment, because you can look at aggregate data, but you can also look at the concentration, right? So where is most of that FDI located? And you would hope that, relatively speaking, you would be moving away from a concentration in Singapore to a number of the other countries. And if you look at the flows for the United States and the changes in concentration relative to, say, Japan and some of the other countries, that's the way in which it's being judged. It's a conversation where I think everybody is aware, the U.S.-Singapore relationship is extremely important. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But when we saw the sort of U.S.-Singapore summit happen here, that's probably the relationship that needs the least tending of the relationships in Southeast. It's probably the greatest relationship to make the point about U.S. Southeast Asia alignment between regional and global interests, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on and so forth. But again, that's not really where the debate is. It's probably more with the other countries in Southeast Asia that are quote unquote, not so like-minded, right? And that we can't keep ignoring that piece of the conversation. Otherwise, we still keep talking to the same folks.
Yeah, so we've done plenty of security and economics. Let's turn to people-to-people again and resourcing of people-to-people relations. So John Brandon at the Asia Foundation says, when I lived in Thailand more than 40 years ago, the U.S. had a robust program, sending speakers throughout the country to speak to university students and other types of organizations. These people explained U.S. policy to everyday citizens, both in capitals and upcountry. Put simply, there was more interaction between Americans and Southeast Asians than with people today. I assume such programs also exist in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. What would you say on how to rejuvenate such programs? Zoom is not an effective substitute, and congratulations on your book, Prashanth.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. And I mean, John is probably much more well-versed and well-placed to answer that question. I'll just offer my sort of 2 cents. One of the things I got in sort of talking to U.S. diplomats in the region, either those who are currently serving or those who previously served, is a number of sort of case studies that they found interesting in that context of successes or limitations. I think one of the points that I keep hearing on both sides, but particularly from the Southeast Asia side, is the reality that how the United States appears to be engaging Southeast Asia 30 years ago versus 20 years ago versus the present. It needs to be more increasingly of a two-way conversation. So and it's a really difficult set of conversations to have. And I'll just give a quick example. The conversation we're having about diversity, equality and inclusion in the United States, I mean, these are issues which are severely challenging in all of these Southeast Asian countries themselves, right? And the question is, how do you have that debate in a way that really acknowledges the challenges for both sides? And also, you don't necessarily always have to say that message very sort of, toughly and directly, right? And one of the effective ways that I've seen this done in the past is the U.S. Embassy in Singapore hosted an event. I think back then it was the Yale NUS partnership, where the conversation was meant to elicit a conversation about inclusion and race and ethnicity. But it started from the conversation of the United States admitting very clearly what the challenge it had with African Americans in the United States. And what you saw in that conversation in the Q&A is that immediately, even though the conversation started there, the questions from the audience was about, oh, this is interesting. I mean, we have some of these challenges here in Singapore as well. And like, I'm wondering, what do we have in common? How do we think about strategies and those parts of the conversations? So I think like, there's really creative work that at least I've found going on in the embassies in the region about effective ways to talk about this. Another really good messaging point that we found, I mentioned Ambassador Mark Napper in Vietnam, the former U.S. ambassador to Malaysia, Kamala Shirin Lakdar, when she left her post, she wrote a really effective, really heartfelt op-ed in Malaysian media where she mentioned, her biggest accomplishment as ambassador was not just, ticking off the boxes on, diplomatic engagement or economics or security, but the fact that she had managed to visit every single place in Malaysia and get out of Kuala Lumpur and spend time in various parts of the country. And I think that's another really effective way to talk about things, because we all know, having visited Southeast Asia, that getting out of the capital cities is sometimes a good way to relax, but also B, you get a lot of credit for knowing about these countries beyond just your academic interest, and you get into conversations about food and all. Some of these conversations are very controversial in Southeast Asia, but being able to have that sort of conversation, getting away from just the substance, and also showing that there's a sense of regard for these countries and how they've come up, right? I mean, keep in mind, 40, 50 years ago, we were talking about countries that were developing. They were, economies that had promise, but some of these countries are extremely advanced. I mean, Singapore is doing a lot of granular work in some of these sectoral areas. Thailand is still one of the largest economies in the world, right? So I think for the Thais to get the sense that, they have some challenges and they have to work through is fine. But engaging these countries, Indonesia is another one. How often do we have to remind people about how large Indonesia is as a country in the aggregate, right? So having that sense of an appreciation for where these countries are and where they're headed, and then also their populations, because as we've kind of talked about before, I don't think it's hard to think of a period of time where that divergence between people's aspirations in Southeast Asia and governments is so broad. And part of that is what governments are doing, but the other part of that is what people are doing in Southeast Asia. I mean, particularly the sort of young populations that do care about the environment immensely, right? That do care about economics and care about a lot of the things that we're talking about.
Thanks. Not to steal your soapbox, but on this point of more two-way equitable people-to-people relationships, I would love to see a United States that is a U.S. administration finally willing to talk honestly about the fact that the Philippines used to be a U.S. colony. And we are in a period of time in this country where we are addressing historical legacies. And this is still one that you don't learn about until you get into grad school in the United States. Nobody teaches you about the Philippine-American War in high school. Filipinos don't get visa-free access to the United States, despite the fact that they were part of the United States. And the president, just last year, recorded a message for the anniversary of U.S.-Philippine diplomatic relations in which he pretended that those diplomatic relations began in 1946. And we don't talk about the 48 years that came before.
And I think it's a really important point you make, Greg, because I think if we don't talk honestly and candidly about the full historical legacy of U.S. relations with Southeast Asia, that also provides a vacuum for conspiracy theories and narratives that persist in the region. Unfortunately, right? You still hear these about how the United States is, a particular U.S. embassy is, housing, military personnel. As if the U.S. government had that kind of interagency coordination to be able to fan these conspiracy theories in the first place. But the point is that they exist in the region, and so if we don't have that honest, candid set of conversations, that only fuels that and also provides a vacuum for other people to define that narrative.
Let's go to Walter Weaver with DAI. Walter says, can you please discuss how certain visible fragilities in democracy in the U.S. are impacting overall U.S. messaging in the region and how regimes in Southeast Asia are responding?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a tough one because I think the aggregate sort of level messaging about democracy that the United States is doing right now under the Biden administration obviously comes with concerns in Southeast Asia about the United States has its own democratic frailties and issues and so on and so forth. And I would actually give the Biden administration some credit. I mean, I tuned in for a lot of the Democracy Summit, and I've looked very carefully at some of the messaging. There's been a real concerted effort to start from a point of view of humility, and also it's still ongoing, but I think a very clear recognition that we can't just talk about democracy. We have to talk about what are the specific areas. So is it environmental governance? Is it civil society cooperation? Is it transparency? Is it anti-corruption? What are the tools that we have? And I think we have seen, like on corruption, for example, a real development of that agenda under the Biden administration in that respect. I think the other prospect that I would hold out is environmental governance. I would say even in countries in Southeast Asia where there might not be state level interest in that, and that's for a whole lot of other reasons, including corruption and transparency, there's a lot of interest among Southeast Asian populations about that. I mean, this is a very sensitive, sort of touchy issue of ownership and heritage. So I think that's probably one place to start, to make that starting from a point of humility is one part of that. And then just really reframing the conversation about, let's have a two-way conversation about what do we mean by democracy and governance. I mean, we mean these very specific things. You clearly have some areas that you want to work on and you're thinking about. We have some areas in that respect, but I will admit, I mean, it's very tough. I mean, it's hard to get into a conversation with regional colleagues these days without the conversation of, what do you think after the midterms is going to happen to U.S. policy in Southeast Asia? Or, yes, the Indo-Pacific strategy is out, but, the U.S. is doing a lot of stuff in the Mekong, and the Indo-Pacific strategy mentioned the Mekong exactly 0 times. Why is that? And these questions are really hard to answer because there's a conversation about what the United States is doing in the region, and then how policy is shaped in Washington. And IPEF is another great example. We're so caught up in which pillar Treasury has and which pillar Commerce has, and irrespective, I mean, everything you see even in the media publicly in Southeast Asia is not let's blame USTR or let's blame Commerce or let's blame X agency. It's the US is doing this or the Biden administration is doing this.
So, Prashanth, the fragilities in our democracy, as Walter calls it, that you talk about how that, I think, contributes to one of the imbalances in your book between interests and values. But I imagine it also contributes, right, to this imbalance you talk about between ends and means. And it strikes me that you've got a lot in the post-Vietnam War section about the, Congress's deep distrust of the war powers of the executive, which we saw play out through the War Powers Act, and how Kissinger talked about how this was the most contentious time to try to make policy since the Civil War, because the administration was just severely constrained in things they wanted to do. Well, now here we are with an administration in which nearly 50% of the electorate seems to think that the other guy won. The Congress is riven. There's no willingness to take up things like a trade initiative, despite the fact that everybody of sound mind in Washington recognizes that that's what you need to do. Ultimately, are we in an era in which this disconnect of ways and means or ends and means is going to outweigh the rising threat perceptions and comparative balance of power in your model?
Yeah, that's a very important consideration, because I think that's very much where we are. I think there's a really important role, and the way I would see it is in a period of constraints for the U.S. Governmentally. So whether we see that in the post-Vietnam War period, we saw that a little bit with the end of the Cold War. And we saw that a little bit actually with the rebalance. When the Obama administration faced some of the challenges in implementing some of that, you did see a little bit more congressional engagement to make sure that that was shored up. And I would say Congress has a really important role to play in that respect. And that's just in the aggregate, making sure that there is this sense of continuity in U.S. policy as we get this sort of framework between what about a different administration, even within the administration, what about X, what about Y, and what about Z. So that's one aspect of that. I would also say, Congress has a really important role to play in terms of advancing in terms of visits to the region, congressional delegations, to major meetings, whether it's the Shangri-La Dialogue or elsewhere, really help create that perception that it really isn't just about what the administration is doing. The other thing that I think is really important, and I obviously this is a work in progress, but one thing I'm really excited to see that the Biden administration is doing, just to be on a more optimistic side, is that there is a deliberate effort to say, we understand that, presidential level commitment matters a lot, and State Department and DOD and so on and so forth, but we really want to have granular ministerial conversations on specific areas. So energy, transportation, women's issues and gender empowerment, so on and so forth. I think the more channels we can create in that respect, the more we'll have a conversation about the intensity of interactions between the United States and Southeast Asia. And not to be on the more pessimistic side, but if we have an administration where there's a lack of presidential commitment, there should be a clear backstop for that. And that is, you take the president out of it, what are the agencies doing? What is Congress doing? And all of the other conversations that we've had about NGOs, businesses that sometimes work with the U.S. government, but sometimes intentionally want to be separate from the U.S. government and play their own game in Southeast Asia as well. So I think all of these are important conversations to have in that respect, because I think we are in that phase where we need to think about just beyond the aggregate level of commitment by the U.S. government. And I would just say, like, we have seen some good initiatives by Congress, not just in terms of hearings, but also, attention to Southeast Asia statements, making sure that ASEAN is being prioritized. So that's good. And I suspect at the U.S. ASEAN summit, we'll see some of that. We'll see ministerial conversations. We'll see a role for Congress, and hopefully that will persist on to the rest of the year as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Prashanth. We're almost at time. So let me bring it home by reminding everybody, the book is Elusive Balances from Paul Gray McMillan. You should go out and buy it. Prashanth's a nice guy. He's got a family to take care of and bills to pay. And as a soon-to-be published author myself, I can say it's a lonely and time-consuming process, and it'd be really nice when people actually read the thing. So, Prashanth, thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again in person real soon. And thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone.